call this hearing to order this morning. We're on our 21st day of hearings on the American Energy Initiative. Over the course of this hearing, we've heard expert testimony on a wide variety of issues and also problematic EPA rules. Many of these new and proposed measures, we believe, threaten to impose high costs and possible job losses on the American people. Quite a few are part of EPA's, in my view, bias against coal. Each new rule adds to the unknown cumulative impact of the multitude of rules that have come out of EPA, many of which are the result of litigation and settlement agreements, and I personally do not believe that's the way to develop environmental policy, through litigation and settlement agreements. However, today we're going to be discussing the proposed National Ambient Air Quality Standard for fine particulate matter. Specifically, EPA's proposal calls for ratcheting down the already stringent annual standard for fine particulate matter set in 2006. The new 2006 standard hasn't even been fully implemented yet. Indeed, this committee recommended in a recent letter to EPA and requested that the agency consider retaining the current standard, but they, I think, have ignored this suggestion. I might add that particulate matter has many natural sources, as you well know, such as forest fires, wind-blown dust, volcanoes, and even sea spray. Even EPA admits that background levels can approach the agency's existing standards and on occasion exceed them. Among the man-made sources of fine particulate matter are a wide variety of activities such as driving a car, running a factory or power plant, farming, and even household fireplaces and backyard barbecues. And it is precisely because fine particulate matter comes from so many different sources and activities that EPA's proposed rules would be costly and intrusive. In fact, in order to achieve earlier particulate matter standards, the agency even issued standards, for example, wood stoves. One can only imagine how many different activities would be impacted by the more stringent proposed rule. It is also important to note that when we are talking about the cost of the proposed fine particulate matter standard, it is not just a matter of dollars and cents. The cost can also be measured in terms of damage to public health and safety. For example, road work is a source of particulate matter emissions, and EPA's proposal could make it harder to undertake the kind of projects that make our roads and highways safer. And we all know that we have a dire infrastructure problem in America today, and we need to be improving our public infrastructure needs. And of course, we're also talking about regulations with the potential to be an obstacle to job creation, and we need to take into account the very serious adverse health implications of unemployment. As costly as the new fine particulate matter standard would be in isolation, we also must be mindful of all the other new and proposed rules that will also apply to many of the same sources and activities. In other words, the cumulative impact of the multitude of rules coming out. Whether it's a domestic manufacturer struggling to remain globally competitive or a coal-fired power plant owner facing costly upgrades in order to remain in compliance, we have to consider the cost of EPA's fine particulate matter proposal in the context of Utility Act, Cross-State Air Pollution Rule, Boiler Act, ozone standards, greenhouse gas regulations, and all others. I should note that reductions in air pollution are an environmental success story. We all are proud of the fact that we have a much cleaner air today than we've had in the past. But I think realistically we also need to ask the question, at what point do you get to a point of diminishing returns? We have a great panel with us today, and you all have great expertise in this area, so we look forward to your testimony and your thoughts on this subject as well. And at this time I'd like to recognize the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Rush, for a 5-minute opening statement.
I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman. We are here today to discuss the EPA's proposal to revise the National Ambient Air Quality Standards for fine particulate matter. As has been the routine since the beginning of this Congress, the majority side has invited witnesses who will testify on the burdens associated with implementation of the proposed revised standards, while the minority side has invited guests to speak on the health impacts associated with particulate matter and why the science informs us that these standards are necessary to protect our most vulnerable constituents. Of course, this hearing is taking place amongst the backdrop of Tuesday's unanimous D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals decision to uphold 4 greenhouse gas regulations, which delivered a huge moral and practical victory for the EPA and its actions. We will dig much deeper into the impact of the court's decisions on that case tomorrow, when we will have the EPA Assistant Administrator for Air and Radiation, Gina McCarthy, testify before the subcommittee. But, Mr. Chairman, as for today's hearing, it is important to recognize how we got to this point. Mr. Chairman, we know that in mid-June, the EPA released a proposal for lowering the fine particle standards from 15 micrograms per cubic meter averaged over a year to between 12 and 13 micrograms, while retaining the current daily standard and the same standards for coarse particles. EPA did not choose to address this proposal in a willy-nilly fashion or without cause, but, Mr. Chairman, I must remind you that they were legally forced to issue this proposal after several states and public health groups challenged the agency for missing an October 2011 deadline for releasing the new standards. That lawsuit came about after a federal court threw out the 2006 standards on the grounds that they were insufficient for protecting the public health. Let me repeat, they threw out the 2006 standards on the grounds that they were insufficient for protecting the public health. In fact, Mr. Chairman, the science is clear that the EPA must strengthen the national air quality standards for particle pollution, which is made up of microscopic specks of soot, metals, acids, dirt, pollen, molds, and aerosols that are tiny enough to inhale and lodge deep in the lungs where they can cause serious damage. As the American Lung Association informs us, breathing these particles can trigger asthma attacks, increase the risk of heart attacks and strokes, damage lung tissue and airways, increase hospital visits for respiratory and cardiovascular problems, and even cause death. The science also informs us that children, teens, senior citizens, people with low incomes, and people with chronic lung disease such as asthma, chronic bronchitis, and emphysema are especially at risk for being sickened by these particles. Mr. Chairman, the court ruled that EPA must propose a standard by June 14th and gave the agency until December 14th to finalize the rule after first holding public hearings, which are set to begin in July. So, Mr. Chairman, we're here today in a very familiar position, with the majority and industry representatives arguing that these rules are too burdensome on industry and will cost jobs, while the minority side will stand by the science and those who argue that these rules will take our most vulnerable citizens and will save lives. Mr. Chairman, we acknowledge that you are the majority. However, Mr. Chairman, the majority does not possess the power to hold back the night. You cannot delay or deny the inevitable. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Rush. And this time I'd like to introduce the members of the panel. We once again appreciate all of you being here, and we look forward to your testimony. We have with us today Mr. Mark Herbst, who is the Executive Director of the Long Island Contractors Association, who's testifying on behalf of the American Road and Transportation Builders Association. We have Mr. Bradford Muller, who's Vice President of Marketing for the Charlotte Pipe and Foundry Company. We have Dr. T. Giadotti, who is a Medical Advisory Services, Inc., is with them, and he's testifying on behalf of the American Thoracic Society. We have Dr. Peter Wahlberg, who is a principal in environmental health at the Gradient Corporation. We have Mr. Colin O'Mara, who is Secretary for the Department of NREC for the state of Delaware. We have Dr. Ann Smith, who's Senior Vice President of NERA Economic Consulting. And then we have Mr. Jeffrey Homestead, who is a partner with Racewell and Giuliani. So welcome once again to all of you, and I'm going to recognize each one of you for a 5-minute opening statement. And at the end of that time, then we'll have some questions for you. And I would just note that on the table there are 2 little boxes, and when your time has expired, the little red light will come on, and we're not going to cut you off immediately, but if you go to 8 or 9 minutes, we might. So anyway, thank you for being with us, and Mr. Herbst, you're recognized for a 5-minute opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Chairman Whitfield, Representative Rush, members of the subcommittee. I am Mark Herbst, Executive Director of the Long Island Contractors Association, and I'm here today on behalf of the American Road and Transportation Builders Association, where I serve as the chairman of the State Council of Executives. ARTBA, now in its 110th year of service, provides federal representation for more than 5,000 members drawn from all business sectors of the U.S. transportation construction industry, public and private. Our industry generates more than $200 billion annually in U.S. economic activity and sustains more than 2.2 million American jobs. We appreciate this opportunity to discuss the Environmental Protection Agency's recent decision to recommend tightening the Federal Clean Air Act standards for particulate matter. At the outset, please know that we share your interest in assuring that all Americans can both breathe clean air and are able to be part of a sound and stable economy. With this in mind, it is essential that all parties involved in this proposal recognize any tightening of the PM standard would increase the number of counties that do not comply with federal standards. As a result, federal highway funds can be withheld from these communities. This reality creates a counterproductive cycle where new standards delay needed improvements to the nation's highway and bridge network, which has already reached critical mass in terms of being able to serve the needs of our citizens and the economy. In many cases, the projects put on hold or canceled are intended to alleviate traffic congestion, a major cause of mobile source emissions. The stated goal of the PM standards is in part to improve public health. Policymakers, however, must be cognizant of the impact more stringent PM standards would have on other federal objectives. Nearly 32,000 people die on U.S. highways each year, and many federal aid highway improvements are intended to address safety issues. As such, EPA's recommendation to tighten PM standards clearly emphasizes one public health threat over another. States and counties need predictability and time to develop transportation plans which achieve PM reduction and create jobs. Adding a new layer of requirements on top of existing standards that have not been fully implemented only complicates these ongoing efforts. Specifically, existing projects deemed to be in compliance with the Clean Air Act when first undertaken could be thrown out of compliance if new standards are approved, exposing project owners to costly, time-consuming litigation. It should be noted that the committee's examination of EPA's proposed PM standards is particularly well-timed as it coincides with efforts to complete the long overdue reauthorization of the Federal Surface Transportation Program. With House and Senate conferees presently meeting around the clock on the transportation bill, all sides are characterizing it as a jobs bill. Allowing this much-needed legislation to be followed by implementation of EPA's recommended PM standards is at best 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Providing resources and important policy reforms to help states deliver critical transportation improvements, while at the same time allowing EPA to greatly reduce the areas where transportation projects can move forward, actually undermines the goal behind the Surface Transportation Bill. It is ironic that members of both chambers and parties have made streamlining the environmental review and approval process for transportation projects a priority of the transportation bill. Yet few talk about the EPA's PM proposal will severely disrupt the very process they are trying to make more effective. Essentially, while any streamlining reforms in the reauthorization bill could save years during the project delivery process, the EPA's proposed PM standards would severely restrict the opportunities states have to take advantage of these reforms. Rather than implement tighter PM standards, EPA should focus on fully implementing the current standards that are already producing improvements in U.S. air quality. Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Rush, members of the subcommittee, ARTBA deeply appreciates this opportunity to present testimony to you on this important issue. I look forward to answering any questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Herbst. And Mr. Muller, you're recognized for a 5-minute opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning. Good morning, Ranking Member Rush, members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today. My name is Brad Muller, and I work for a family-owned 4th-generation company which has been in continuous operation since 1901, producing cast iron pipe and fittings for plumbing. Charlotte Pipe is one of only 3 U.S. foundries left in America that produce the types of metal castings that we do, and dozens of competing foundries have gone out of business in the last 2 decades. We employ 450 associates at our foundry, Mr. Chairman, many of whom have been there for decades. In recent years, Charlotte Pipe and the entire metal casting industry has been hard hit by this recession. Despite a massive loss of sales, we have not laid off any associates, sacrificing our profitability to keep our people working. Today, I have the privilege of speaking on behalf of not only our company's associates, but also other domestic foundries as part of the American Foundry Society, our industry's trade association, which has more than 8,500 members in every state. We are alarmed, Mr. Chairman, by a wave of new regulations that EPA is imposing that you documented earlier. As an energy-intensive industry, we are significantly impacted by increased electricity costs and reliability issues that will result from these regulations. Of particular concern are EPA's new mercury and air toxic standards for coal-fired plants, known as Utility MACT. The rule requires major overhauls of power plants around the country and is forecasted to result in double-digit increases in electricity prices in at least 30 states. On the heels of the Utility MACT, EPA proposed in March the first ever greenhouse gas standards for power plants, a rule that will effectively ban new coal-fired plants in this country and could threaten existing coal-fired generation. According to a study conducted by NERA, the combined estimated cost of the 2012 EPA regulations is a staggering $127 billion. In addition, Mr. Chairman, the EPA has failed, as you noted, to consider the cumulative impact of its power sector regulations on grid reliability. So far, more than 140 coal-fired generating units in 19 states have announced they will retire by 2015, creating volatility within the electric grid if steps are not taken to balance the retirements with new capacity. EPA recently announced a proposed rule that would increase the stringency of the Naxx standards for fine particulate matter. The more stringent PM 2.5 standards will bring additional costs for existing foundries and create huge hurdles to permitting for expansions and new plants, the exact situation that we encountered. A few years ago, Charlotte Pipe bought a significant amount of land in Stanley County in rural North Carolina with the intention of building a new state-of-the-art high-efficiency foundry, enclosing our current location in downtown Charlotte. After we drew up plans for the facility, we submitted our air permit for review. State regulators eventually told us that while previous air dispersion models only had to account for filterable particulate, new air permits now require condensables to be included in the total PM 2.5 emissions, making the standard that much more difficult to meet. This permitting change, combined with EPA's intention to lower the standards, made it impossible for us to build a new plant. In our case, naturally occurring levels in rural North Carolina, where we were going to build the foundry, were at 12.8 parts per billion, higher than EPA's lower end of the range, proposed range. Instead of the 450 acres we bought, Charlotte Pipe would need 4,500 acres to comply with the new standards. A new plant would have brought 1,800 jobs, including about 1,000 permanent new jobs, to what is currently a depressed area of rural North Carolina. The tax benefit of constructing and opening a new foundry in Stanley County was estimated to be about $70 million over the initial 4-year period, with $17 million each year thereafter. Charlotte Pipe understands and supports the need for reasonable regulations to protect the environment, worker safety, and health. But the continued ratcheting down of emission limits produces diminishing returns at far higher costs. EPA's new stringent standards will put many regions out of attainment, and manufacturers considering a place to build a plant and/or expand production will not be able to obtain the necessary permits. Thank you again for the opportunity to appear today, and I'd be happy to respond to questions, sir.
Thank you very much. And Dr. Giudotti, you're recognized for 5 minutes. Would you put your mic just a little bit closer?
Excellent. Thank you for this opportunity. My name is T. Giudotti. I'm a medical doctor and environmental health scientist with training in epidemiology and training and qualifications in toxicology. I've held many positions over my career, including professor and chair of the Department of Environmental and Occupational Health at George Washington University. I'm now an international consultant based here in Washington, D.C. I'm here today representing the American Thoracic Society, which is the world's leading medical organization devoted to advancing clinical and scientific understanding of pulmonary diseases, critical illness, and sleep-related breathing disorders. The American Thoracic Society supports EPA adopting a much stronger standard for fine particulate matter, PM 2.5. First, on the grounds that revision of the standard will be protective of human health. And second, on the grounds that the scientific evidence accumulated by EPA is sufficient and compelling to justify a move to a more protective standard at this time. The ATS recommends an annual standard of 11 micrograms per cubic meter, combined with a 24-hour standard of 25 micrograms per cubic meter. That specific recommendation has been supported by a wide range of medical societies and public health organizations, including the American Medical Association, the American Academy of Pediatrics, the American Lung Association, the American Heart Association, and the American Public Health Association. The ATS further believes that the scientific evidence that supports the proposed revision and upon which EPA relies is sound, comprehensive, and validated. This body of evidence is the product of decades of intensive research conducted with stringent oversights, double and triple checking results, reanalysis to confirm every important finding, and laboratory validation of observations in human populations. Hundreds, probably now thousands, of studies in the United States and around the world have confirmed that elevations in fine particulate matter are associated with an increased risk of premature death, cardiovascular disease, hospitalization for respiratory and cardiovascular diseases, and respiratory symptoms within days of the exceedance. A number of very large studies in the U.S. and around the world have looked at the long-term health effects of ambient particles. These studies have provided firm evidence linking long-term exposure to ambient particulate matter and all-cause mortality, cardiovascular mortality, and non-fatal cardiovascular events. The impact of particulate air pollution on life expectancy, in a word, is substantial. In the scientific review of the 2009 Integrated Science Assessment for Particulate Matter, the external panel of independent scientists that makes up the Clean Air Scientific Advisory Committee, commonly called CASAC, and the EPA scientists involved have concluded that a causal relationship, meaning that evidence exists for a cause and effect, not just an association, a cause and effect relationship, is strong between ambient fine particulate matter and both mortality, meaning deaths, and cardiovascular effects, and that the evidence for a cause and effect relationship with respiratory effects is almost as strong. These conclusions were reached following a rigorous review. EPA convened 10 multi-day public workshops, CASAC meetings, and teleconferences beginning in 2007 in a transparent process that allowed scientific peer review by the CASAC and public comment at every step. The science has been thoroughly vetted. CASAC reached a unanimous conclusion that a range of 11 to 13 micrograms per cubic meter for the annual standard was scientifically justified. In epidemiology, there are guides to whether an association is likely to be causal or non-causal, meaning that the true cause may be indirect because it acts on both the risk factor and the outcome, or that it may be spurious. All of these criteria have been abundantly satisfied in the case of fine particulate matter, and there has been equally strong confirmatory and mechanistic evidence derived from toxicology, from animal studies and human volunteer studies and laboratory studies that now show us why this is happening and give us a window on the mechanism of why these things happen. These scientific studies have linked particulate matter exposure to problems including aggravated asthma in children, increased emergency department visits, stroke, heart attacks, more frequent deaths and second heart attacks from people who have already had one, and hospital admissions. It also demonstrates that the situation is worse for certain parts of the population, such as children and teenagers, the elderly, and people who already have cardiovascular disease. Congress built into the Clean Air Act an orderly, systematic process for the regular review of scientific evidence related to the health effects of air pollution. The American Thoracic Society strongly supports the authority of the EPA to periodically review and update the air quality standards as mandated by the Clean Air Act. The evidence of harm from particulate matter pollution underscores how important it actually is for EPA to review and adjust health standards on an ongoing basis, and ATS believes that Congress should continue to allow them to do so. Thank you.
Thank you. And Dr. Wahlberg, you're recognized for a 5-minute opening statement.
Thank you, and good morning to Chairman and members of the committee. I appreciate this opportunity to speak. I'm Peter Wahlberg, principal at Gradient, an environmental health consulting firm in Boston. I've worked for many years in public health and inhalation toxicology. For about a decade, I was a faculty member at the Harvard School of Public Health. I was a member of the National Academy of Sciences panel that looked at the public health benefits of air quality regulation. I've testified before the Clean Air Science Advisory Committee. And today I'm testifying about the toxicity of airborne particulate matter, which I'll call PM. And what I point to are the critical role of experimental science in evaluating the PM health effects. And I do this because I believe the EPA's health effects analysis of PM relies too heavily on statistical associations per se, and EPA undervalues the role of laboratory science in helping understand the toxicology of PM. Our scientific knowledge is based of health risk is based on 3 legs of evidence. One leg is statistical, epidemiology. Another leg is clinical data and experimental studies with lab animals. And the third leg is understanding biological mechanism. If any legs are weak or missing, as is in the case of ambient PM, at the levels of the PM standard, the reliability of our knowledge is compromised. Experimental science calls into question EPA's forecasts of harm such as death caused by small increments in PM levels at concentrations close to the present-day standards. That is, neither data from lab animals inhaling PM nor human clinical data validate a causal basis for the statistical associations between PM levels and mortality that are reported by some of the observational epidemiology studies. Moreover, toxicologists have studied the chemicals that constitute PM in outdoor air, and no one has found an ambient PM constituent that is life-threatening when breathed at levels that we encounter outdoors. Remember that in human responses to chemical intake, it's the dose that makes the poison. And with regard to mechanistic support, EPA does not provide a sequence of recognized biological events whereby low levels in the range of 12 or 13 micrograms per cubic meter of outdoor PM will lead to death or effects serious enough to cause hospitalization. On a more practical side, EPA's health harm projections for PM, which are based on statistical associations, are contradicted by the health of people in dusty occupations, where worker studies show that at levels of PM considerably above ambient PM levels do not show increased mortality rates in those worker populations. Likewise, in our own everyday experience, we all breathe elevated levels of PM in our homes, cars, personal activities such as lawn mowing, raking leaves, barbecuing, vacuuming, sitting by a fireplace. The PM levels we breathe are vastly higher than the PM in typical outdoor air, and although of short term, these elevated levels contribute significantly to our annual and lifetime PM dose. And EPA does not make it clear that according to their own health harm projections for PM, these indoor levels should be vastly more harmful than outdoor PM. EPA relies on statistical associations between central monitor PM levels and population mortality rates, but such correlations cannot establish causal links. The computer models required to uncover these PM mortality correlations require many assumptions and adjustments. The results you get depend on the model you use, how you set it up, and how many different tests you run. It's not possible to correct for many non-PM air pollutants as well as non-pollution factors that may confound these PM associations. This model dependency is a known problem and has been pointed out in numerous publications. Many unknown factors can affect population mortality rates. For example, studies have shown that population mortality is correlated with calendar date, day of the week, stock prices, weather, or outcome of sports events. And yet we wouldn't think of outlawing certain calendar dates or the Super Bowl on the basis of these associations, which are quite consistent. Even if we restrict our attentions to statistical studies per se, there are unexplained inconsistencies in reported PM effect factors across urban areas, with no PM risk being reported for many cities, leaving uncertainty as to whether lowering the standards will truly yield health benefits. And EPA does not explain or delve into why these no effect or inconsistent findings should be disregarded in favor of those studies that do show small effects. In summary, EPA's statistical approach is fraught with numerous assumptions and uncertainties, and EPA does not provide experimental evidence and laboratory science to support PM causing death and hospitalizations at levels below the current standards. Moreover, since EPA admits they have no understanding of which PM constituent or which PM chemical they believe causes the deaths they predict, does it really make sense to lower the standards without such more specific information? Thank you for the opportunity to speak, and I welcome your questions and comments.
Well, thank you, Dr. Wahlberg. And Mr. O'Mara, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Rush, members of the subcommittee. My name is Colin O'Mara. I serve as the Secretary of Energy and Environment for the state of Delaware, and it's my pleasure to be with all of you today. The proposal that we're discussing today is measured. It's based on sound science. It's technically feasible, it's cost-effective, and it's been a long time in the making. The PM 2.5 Naxx currently in effect includes an annual standard of 15 micrograms per cubic meter, which was promulgated in 1997. And then in 2006, the 24-hour standard of 35 micrograms per cubic meter was established. As a result of litigation, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia remanded the 2006 annual PM2 standard, 2.5 standard, to EPA because the agency at the time failed to explain adequately why the standard provided the requisite protection for at-risk populations, including children. When it became clear that EPA would fail to meet its promised deadlines to the court, many of the plaintiffs, including the state of Delaware and several other states, and the American Lung Association, filed mandamus petitions in the D.C. Circuit in November 2011 on grounds that EPA had unreasonably delayed responding to the remand order from 2006, and the court then ordered EPA to respond. EPA has now proposed its response, concluding that the PM 2.5 standards established in 2006 are indeed insufficient to protect public health, as required by the Clean Air Act, and that the proposed revisions are warranted to provide the appropriate degree of increased public health protection. This proposed action by EPA is both a legislative and court-mandated requirement that is long overdue and necessary. Peer-reviewed science clearly supports EPA's action. In December 2009, EPA published an analysis of the particulate matter-related peer-reviewed health science literature in its Integrated Science Assessment, the ISA, which concluded that the epidemiologic, controlled human exposure, and toxicological studies each provide evidence for increased vulnerability of various populations, such as children, older adults, people with pre-existing diseases, and lower-income individuals. In June 2010, EPA then published its quantitative health risk assessment for particulate matter to quantify exposure and risk. This analysis estimated that between 63 and 88,000 premature deaths each year are related to PM 2.5 exposure. Then in April this year of 2011, EPA published its policy assessment for review of particulate matter national ambient air quality standards, which recommended revising the annual standard in the range of 11 to 13 micrograms per cubic meter, and then recommended leaving the current 24-hour standard exactly the same at 35, recommended changing it, either leaving it at 35 or reducing it to 30. EPA has proposed to update the annual PM 2.5 standard within the range of this 11 to 13 as recommended by the experts. They proposed staying between 12 and 13 at the upper end of the range, and then to retain the 24-hour PM 2.5 standard. In doing so, EPA exercised and is demonstrating moderation. The agency easily could have selected, for example, a number at the lower end of the range, i.e. 11. They could have set a tighter daily standard below 35, and they could have set a more stringent PM 10 standard. In other words, the proposal could have been much more stringent. Finalizing this action at the lower end of the proposal, so at 12, will provide increased protection for at-risk populations against an array of PM 2.5 related adverse health effects and give the public greater confidence that the air they are breathing is actually healthy. Some have questioned whether we can afford this rule. Even though EPA is statutorily prohibited from considering the cost of implementing the Naxx, they have conducted a regulatory impact analysis which provides the potential costs and benefits of several different alternatives. An analysis of this report suggests that the benefits of the protective 12 micrograms per cubic meter standard as proposed outweigh the costs by a ratio of 30 to 1 to 85 to 1. That's $30 of benefits for every $1 of cost, up to $85 of benefit for every $1 of cost. Our experience in Delaware reinforces both the importance of this rule and the cost-benefit analysis for this standard. We have proven in Delaware repeatedly that measures which will achieve a health-based PM 2.5 standard are both technically feasible and cost-effective. Under the Clean Air Act, states are given the flexibility to meet standards in the most cost-effective manner by considering the economic impacts when implementing rules to meet a more health-protective standard, and this is exactly what we've done in Delaware. For example, in 2006, we promulgated a regulation that required NOx, SOx, and mercury emission controls on all of our coal and oil-fired power plants. This multi-pollutant approach allowed affected facilities to design the most cost-effective emission controls that would reduce these multiple pollutions at the same time. It's important to note that this approach did not require a specific target for PM 2.5, but through this approach, we've already reduced PM 2.5 emissions by 63% from the 2006 levels and will be reduced by 83% by 2013. These are already projects that are in the works. This is not speculative data. These are actual projects that are on the ground. We've worked with some of the largest companies in Delaware, including NRG, Calpine, PBF, DuPont, Purdue, Mount Air, Everest Steel, and Croda to reduce their emissions, including PM2. We've seen dramatic decreases across several sectors. Most of these projects have been actually kind of public-private partnerships, if you will, with the state sometimes providing financing or expediting permitting to ensure that reductions across multiple pollutants, timely project completion, creation of construction jobs, and improve economic competitiveness. We believe that we are proving they can have both a very strong economy and a healthy environment at the same time. Yet, despite significant progress in Delaware to reduce PM 2.5 and other traditional pollutants, our state continues to suffer adverse health effects from sources of transport that contribute more than 95% of the PM 2.5 in Delaware. The proposed national standard will bring us one step closer to reducing this transport pollution that continues to plague our downwind states, and in doing so will help ensure healthy air for all of our residents. Thank you for the opportunity to be with you today, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, and Dr. Smith, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for inviting me. I am Ann Smith, a Senior Vice President at NERA Economic Consulting. I'm an economics and risk assessment professional. My testimony is my own and does not represent the position of my company or its clients. The proposed PM Naxx will likely be more costly than EPA is reporting, and its benefits are far more uncertain than EPA indicates. One feature of the proposed rule that will drive costs above what EPA has estimated is a new requirement that the fine PM monitors be placed near roads in each area. Near road monitors can be expected to have much higher fine PM readings than the monitors that are currently used to assess attainment status. On its own, this new monitor requirement may seem innocuous, but EPA is also proposing that attainment status now be determined by each region's single worst-case monitor. That worst-case reading is likely to come from the newly placed near-road monitor. So any Naxx level, including the current Naxx level, if it were still in effect, will become much more difficult to meet as a result of these changes. EPA has not accounted for the costs of the extra stringency that these combined changes in the rule would create. EPA's estimates of the benefits of the proposed PM Naxx are far more uncertain than EPA admits. The administrator argues for not setting the primary standard below 12 micrograms per cubic meter because of increasing lack of confidence that she has in predictions of health impacts from yet lower fine PM levels. But the administrator's lack of confidence has not prevented EPA from taking full credit for those predicted health impacts as if they were absolutely certain when estimating the proposed rule's dollar benefits. And yet more uncertainty is missing in EPA's dollar benefits estimates. For example, almost all of EPA's estimate of benefits is based on a presumption that the statistical association between fine PM and mortality risk is a causal relationship. That presumption of causality is still subject to question. This point has been demonstrated vividly by a new method of analyzing the fine PM risk data that was published in the Journal of the American Statistical Association just a year ago, after EPA's causal determination was finalized. When striking new evidence suddenly emerges that a regulatory action may have no benefits at all, it would seem prudent for EPA to take the time to more closely examine and deliberate the new evidence before locking into major new regulatory action. But also this ongoing uncertainty should at least be recognized in the benefits estimates, and it is not. Let me now turn to the proposed new secondary standard to protect urban visibility. This unusual new proposed standard in the proposed rule deserves close inspection. It would be based on an arcane indicator called the deciview. And that deciview has some troubling implications for a PM standard. For one, a uniform national deciview standard will limit fine PM concentrations to very different levels in different cities. Just as an example, a 28 deciview standard, such as EPA is proposing, would imply 24-hour average fine PM limits that could be as low as 18 micrograms per cubic meter in some areas and as high as 43 micrograms per cubic meter in other areas. A huge variation. Each U.S. city will face a different PM standard under the proposed deciview standard. While EPA says the visibility standard would have minimal cost, small variations from the proposed level and form can make it much more stringent than the primary standard to protect health. But even if this visibility standard would be binding in only a couple of cities, as EPA says, do we really want a rule that makes some cities spend more to protect its public from its aesthetic distress than it will have to spend to get its ambient PM levels down to levels that EPA considers protective of the public health? No, this is clearly a reversal of reasonable public spending priorities. It also is unjustifiable because the EPA is using a scientifically indefensible method to determine when and if visibility degradation does adversely affect public welfare. EPA has ignored evidence that has been provided regarding the method's lack of credibility. If this evidence were to be acknowledged, there would be no basis for setting any visibility standard. Thank you. I have a longer written statement that substantiates the points I've made, and I request that it also be entered into the record, and I'd be happy to accept questions.
Thank you, Dr. Smith. And Mr. Homestead, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Rush, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me. My name is Jeff Homestead, and I am a partner in the law firm of Bracewell and Giuliani. But today I'm not representing my law firm or any client. I've not talked with anybody about my views, but I'm here just to talk about this proposal as someone who has really spent his professional life working on the Clean Air Act and looking at what works, what doesn't, and really looking at the implications of the various different Clean Air Act programs that we have. As some of you know, I was the head of the EPA Air Office for almost 5 years, and so I like to believe I know a lot about what works in the Act and what doesn't. My primary concern about the new proposed standards for PM is that EPA is not being honest about the burden that will impose on state and local governments, on businesses and companies, and on American consumers. And I was amused. Some of you may have seen these charts and press releases, but you know the press release says EPA proposes Clean Air Act standards. 99% of U.S. counties will meet the standards without any actions, any additional actions. 99% of counties. They have a map that says, oh, this isn't going to do anything. Depending on where we set the standard, you're going to have either 2 additional counties or 4 or 6 additional counties that will have to take any action to meet these new standards. Well, that would be great if that's how the Clean Air Act worked. If all you have to do is wait for existing programs to get the air into attainment by this 2020 date. But as I say, that's not the way the Clean Air Act works. As soon as EPA finalizes a new standard, there are immediate permitting burdens that, as several people have said, makes it much more difficult to permit anything, regardless of whether EPA is projecting that you're going to meet the standard in just a few years. So anyway, it frustrates me because I think the Clean Air Act is important. I think there are important benefits from the Clean Air Act. I just think we need to be honest with people about what the burdens are, and my own view is we ought to try to be achieving those benefits in the most cost-effective way possible. If I can just point out a couple of other concerns, and others have already mentioned some of these, especially Dr. Smith, but this idea that this is only a minor adjustment to the standard because we're just reducing it from 15 to 13 or 12 completely ignores some of the key parts of this proposal. If we are now, today, essentially, you put these monitors out in an area and you average across all those monitors because everybody has essentially said that PM 2.5 is an area-wide issue. You don't look at the highest monitor, you look at the average of all these monitors. Now we're going to be looking at the worst-case single monitor, and we're going to be putting a monitor nearby a road that will certainly be, in almost all cases, the highest monitor. So we don't know whether the standard is going to increase the stringency by 30% or by 50%. And I don't think there's any way for EPA really to know for sure. I just think we need to be honest about the implications of that. I'm also, as someone who's been a regulator, a little troubled about this new secondary visibility standard. Although it is cloaked as a scientific determination, as Dr. Smith's testimony explains, it really is extremely subjective, extremely variable from one place to the other. And the idea that you have someone that essentially says, we're going to force society to spend a lot of money because we think that there's a problem with visibility in urban centers. That's not what Congress designed the Clean Air Act to do, and I don't think that's an appropriate exercise of authority by a regulatory agency. So I'm just troubled, again, that the Clean Air Act seems to be misused for something it was never intended to be used for. I'm actually a big believer in the Clean Air Act, in the gains that we've achieved. I think it's one of the major success stories of the federal government, but we're spending a lot more money than we need to spend as a society. And unfortunately, there are many parts of the Clean Air Act that have come to be used as weapons by people who oppose a transportation project, even a state-of-the-art new facility to build something, to manufacture something. And I think it's time that we were honest with people about the implications of this, and that perhaps we look for a more effective ways to achieve our Clean Air Act goals. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Homestead, and thank all of you for your testimony. And at this time, I recognize myself for 5 minutes of questions. First comment I would make is that I've sat through 21 of these hearings in the last period of months, and I think it's very easy for people to say, well, Democrats support the Clean Air Act. Republicans basically oppose the Clean Air Act and simplify the debate. And yet, after the hearings that I've sat through, I genuinely believe that Administrator Jackson is misleading the American people either wittingly or unwittingly. And why do I say that? Because of this. You made the comment, Mr. Homestead, that EPA is not being honest. And I think that is true in some instances. For example, when they adopted the Utility MACT, which they call the mercury rule, they said that the primary benefit from the Utility MACT adoption would come from reduction of mercury. That would be the primary benefit. And yet their own analysis, and everyone agreed that the real benefit did not come from mercury emission. In fact, there was minute benefit from mercury emission. It all came from reduction of particulate matter. And just like Mr. Wahlberg has talked about how there's no real evidence of which particulate matter causes health problems, EPA admits they have no understanding of which particulate matter constituents cause their predicted deaths or health problems. They admit that. And yet, frequently in the analysis that they present up here, everything seems to be absolutely 100% certain. And another frustration that I've had, and Dr. Giudotti, you wrote a book entitled Global Occupational Health. And I haven't read all of it, but I read parts of it and think it's very good. But you made the comment, employment is one of the most significant determinants of health, even though it is not a typical work-related hazard. And you also said good research strongly links unemployment with adverse health effects. And Mr. Mueller made the comment that 140 coal plants by 2015 have announced they're going to be closing. And our economy is pretty weak now, so those people are going to lose their jobs. And Mr. Mueller is not going to be able to expand his business because he can't meet these air permit requirements. He was going to hire 1,800 people. Some of those people may be unemployed. And yet EPA never looks at the cost of health because of a new regulation that causes unemployment. And I would ask you, Dr. Giudotti, do you believe, I mean, none of us want to get rid of the Clean Air Act, but it hadn't really been looked at since 1990. Do you think that that's a valid subject that we should explore of the health impacts on those people and their families who lose their jobs?
Well, certainly I do, or I wouldn't have written that. I think that
and that's why I quoted it.
I'm not entirely sure that I personally wrote that, but you're referring to a book that had multiple authors. The point, though, is well taken that that there are unemployment as well as many other social factors that do, on a population basis and on an individual basis, as we can see with our friends and neighbors, affect a person's health. Nothing affects a person's health as badly, though, as having a disease. And
well, let me just interrupt a minute. And I agree with you that they have diseases, but people who don't have access to health care get diseases also. So I don't want to argue the point. I'm just saying that I think it's a mistake that they not at least explore the impact of loss of health care on people who lose their job because of these regulations or are not able to get a job.
Mr. Chairman?
May I respond?
Who said that?
Mr. Chairman.
Oh, yes.
I'd just like to reinforce, when we look at climate change, the justification for the Clean Air Act and climate change was that the disruption of economies around the world would affect humans and human lives, and that basically the major health impacts of climate change was economic chaos that was created for it. It's interesting that it was able to be applied to climate change issues, but not based on the economic impacts of regulation. It was sort of like a double standard because we looked at the economic impact of climate change, but we sort of say that it's sacrilege to look at the economic impact of regulation. Isn't there an inconsistency there?
Well, my time's expired, and thanks to the gentleman from California, I'm going to get 20 seconds back from you now. This time I recognize the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Rush.
Dr. Godotti, a lot of statements have been made this morning, and you heard many of them. You were just asked a question by the chair. For the record, would you care to respond more thoroughly to some of the claims that you heard today? And you're a trained physician. You want to talk about some of the known health impacts associated with breathing in these particles. And you want to expound a little bit more on the statement in the book that you co-authored about the unemployment impact on health. My district is a very poor district, high unemployment, and I agree that it does have a serious impact on health. But where does that fit in terms of this discussion that we're debating today?
Well, thank you very much for asking. I think that we're dealing with a complicated situation in which the environment comes together with social factors, comes together with health factors. I am qualified to speak about the health factors, and that's what I'm going to focus on here. I think that the productivity and the continued future of sustainable health and economy in this and any other country depends on having competitive technology, and increasingly that means clean technology, and it also means having a healthy workforce, a workforce that is sick, a workforce in which disabled individuals can't work because their health is further impaired by environmental factors, people who are at high risk of death that would be entirely avoidable and would be if they were sufficiently protected, and people who are present at work but aren't able to focus and aren't able to work at full capacity because their diseases like lung diseases and like allergies are made that much worse, are also a strong brake and a strong resistance to full productivity. So I don't think that this is an easy issue of employment, unemployment, and trade-off between health and employment. I think that the future of the American workforce depends in large part on being healthier relative to other workforces, maintaining and preferably enhancing the health that we have today so that we are more competitive and healthier compared to other countries than we are currently.
Is there a scientific basis for the EPA's proposal for lowering the fine particle standards from 15 micrograms per cubic meter average over a year to between 12 and 13 micrograms?
Yes, and thank you for asking. Dr. Valberg referred to a three-legged stool, and I think that we can, with its acknowledging that it has drawbacks, I think that we can talk about that three-legged stool in terms of the epidemiologic evidence, which has the one overwhelming benefit in that it tells us about human beings. And the evidence there is overwhelming. I mentioned the guides to assessing statistical evidence as being likely to be causal. They are completely satisfied and indeed overwhelming in the case of fine particulate matter. If you look at toxicology, however, toxicology is the science of poisons and the effects of external agents on the body. And we have very strong toxicological evidence that fine particulate matter is disproportionately toxic to the human body. And because of the third leg of the stool, which has to do with biomedical and laboratory research, we now have a pretty clear idea of why. And we know, for example, that ambient fine particulate matter in the outdoor environment is not necessarily the same particulate matter that we have in the indoor environment. that the toxicity of these fine particles depends on the size and the distribution, and I've got to come back to that because that's a truly critical factor. Their composition, and we now know that those fine particulate particles that include metals are far more toxic than others, and they're more likely to include metals when they're ambient. And atmospheric transformation, because there are processes in the environment that actually change the particles, change the chemical composition as they age in the atmosphere. Size is particularly important because the tiny particles we're talking about, so much lower than the size of particles that in some of the studies that Dr. Valberg was alluding to earlier, get into places in the body that the larger particles don't. And that means that the dose that the cell sees, the dose that the tissue sees, is a lot higher than the dose that's delivered, say, in an experimental study or that's measured outside. So it's a size distribution, composition, and atmospheric transformation are critical factors that you simply don't see in the indoor air pollution.
The gentleman's time has expired. This time recognize the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Griffith, for 5 minutes.
Dr. Gudotti, let me pick up a little bit there. If I follow your reasoning, if there's a scientific basis to establish that people who have allergies or lung diseases may be adversely affected, then the EPA under the Clean Air Act should take action against the offending items. Is that your testimony?
No, I think that's an extrapolation of my testimony. I think that...
Was it accurate?
The reality... What's that?
Is it accurate, yes or no?
Could you repeat it?
If there's a scientific basis to establish that there's something in the air that is causing people with allergies and lung diseases to suffer, they may not be able to pay attention as well to work when they're working, or they may not be able to do things that they might otherwise do if this item wasn't present in the air, that the EPA should take action. Is that the extrapolation of your testimony, and is that accurate?
No, it is not.
All right, tell me why.
Well, because
that's what I heard.
What's that?
That's what I heard, sir.
Well, I'm sorry that you heard it that way. Let me clarify, please. Well,
let me try to straighten it out because I only have so much time.
Excuse me?
I only have so much time, so let me try to straighten it out then. Because that's what I thought I heard you saying, that the EPA proposed rules would based on a scientific basis, that some of these items cause people not to be able to perform as well, and that people with allergies and lung disease, we should be trying to take care of them. Is that not what you said? I need a simple answer, yes or no.
That you said is correct. The first statement is not.
What's not correct?
What's not correct is that the implication that you said in the earlier statement that it was...
So the second statement was correct.
What's that?
The second statement was correct.
The second statement was correct with regard to the...
So let me go through then, because here's what I heard you saying, and understand that I may be a little edgy today, because yesterday my wife had my son at the allergist's, and he has been under an allergist care since he was 4 months old. He's 6 now. What I heard you say was the EPA ought to be taking actions against trees, because my son's number one problem is trees. I have an issue with trees as well. You know, the problem is you can take these things to an extreme, to a point where they no longer make sense. And I would submit that that's where we are with these new standards that the EPA is proposing. Yes, you could make my son's life a whole lot better if you tore down every tree in the United States of America and the world. But that obviously is ridiculous. But I would submit that what the EPA is now trying to do to these gentlemen trying to produce jobs is just as ridiculous, because we have to have jobs. And as your book, whether you wrote that chapter or not, says, unemployment also has an effect. And what we're doing is we're killing jobs left and right. And you know, it's so significant in my district. I represent a coal mining area. Not all of my district is coal mining, but a big chunk of it is. There's a bumper sticker out there that says, if you think coal is ugly, wait till you see poverty. And I submit that what we're doing is we're putting a lot of people out of work. We're making the overall economic situation so bad that people are truly hurting, and that's going to have a bigger health impact than these new regulations would have. The positive impact these new regulations would have is offset by a tremendous negative. Let me ask Mr. Herbst this question in the time that I have remaining. They're also in my district building a road up the side of Christiansburg Mountain. and had to blow up half the mountain or half of one of the hills, depending on how you want to define them, to get this road laid out. Are you telling me that under these new standards we probably wouldn't have been able to add that extra lane?
That's a very good possibility. The concern that we have is the additional regulation changing things. We were given with the stimulus program, if I can use that as an example, what we saw is all this available money for localities, for counties, states to come down for construction projects. And what the problem that we had was the threefold. Number one, a lot of the municipalities did not apply because they didn't want the strings attached. Number two was another example that we're still going through right now with a contractor who is owed over $1 million, family-owned small business, isn't being paid because the regulators came in afterwards and audited and said all of these procedures by the owner, which was a municipality, didn't fulfill their obligation. So the municipality turns around and tells the owner, we're just not going to pay you. So this contractor is out over $1 million and is fledgling right now and may not stay in business. So that's a problem with the additional regulation. The third one is probably more closely related to your issue is we had one contractor through this program that was bid the job to straighten out a curb line along a roadway, major roadway in the town. And what happened was the federal government came in and said, you know what? You need land takings, less than 1.5 feet. It's not following the federal regulations. You're not eligible for the funds, and that project could not go forward. So that's what regulation does. We're told you can go ahead and do this. Meanwhile, we've lost 40,000 jobs in the industry, just in my bi-county region.
Just in your region?
Yes.
40,000 jobs?
Yes.
I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman's time has expired. At this time, I recognize the gentleman from West Virginia, Mr. McKinley, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess let's start with you, Mr. Homestead, from your experience. Does the EPA have, does it have authority to regulate air quality in a school building?
Inside a building, no.
Inside?
No, they do not.
Does it have the authority to regulate air in a home?
No, it does not.
Does it have authority to regulate the air in this room?
No, I don't believe it has any authority to regulate.
Does it have the authority to regulate air in my former office building?
No.
Does it have the authority to regulate the air in my car?
I don't think so.
Thank you. I'm just curious because I want to build back off what Mr. Wahlberg was saying, Dr. Wahlberg. And what we've heard here over the last 18 months of my term here in Congress has been about air quality, and I've struggled as an engineer, one of just two of us in Congress, to see how we differentiate between indoor air quality and outdoor air quality. When we talk about the diseases that people are coming down with, how have we, maybe Dr. Wahlberg, maybe if you could explain, how do we differentiate that when someone has an asthma attack, why is it that some folks in this chamber will say it's caused by outdoor air, but 90% of our time is spent in indoor air? How do you think people can differentiate between where they get the particular matter that causes an asthma attack?
That's a very good question, and I agree with Dr. Guidotti that the composition of different types of air is in fact different. But it is EPA's position that, you know, according to their paradigm and their formula, they treat it all equally, even though indoor air may be different.
But have you seen the EPA's own website? Their own website says that indoor air quality is 96 times worse than outdoor air?
Yes, it is. Not only is it worse, but we mostly spend our time indoors. I think we all have this impression that if we want fresh air, we go outdoors. If we want to have more stale air, we're usually indoors.
Dr. Wahlberg, you know, the whole panel, look, and from an engineer, I know we can achieve this. Science and manufacturers, everyone can provide us even better air quality. We know that. We can achieve that. It's one of these moving targets, however, that disturbs me as a former businessman that, you know, just because we can doesn't mean we should. Just because we can doesn't mean we should. And so I'm looking to see if we're trying to get down to 13 micrograms per cubic meter today, well, what's the real goal? Where do we really want it? Why don't we just set that's the real goal we're going to? 0? Is it 1? Once we start down that slippery slope, I don't understand where we're going. Because I'm disturbed about us using the EPA is using science and the Clean Air Act as a weapon, as you described. Let me just, for all of you to understand what we're really quibbling over here, is this approximately 2 micrograms per cubic meter. And it's going to cost our economy billions of dollars to comply. But I know in this room, so few people can relate to engineering terms or scientific terms. I love the use of epidemiology and toxicology and pulmonologists. I'm just saying, let's put it in relationship to where people can understand. In this room is approximately 70,000 cubic feet of space. What we're talking about at 2 micrograms per cubic meter, the amount of the weight of particular matter is the size of this piece of paper. This is smaller than a point on your eraser. That's what we're talking about here. That's the billions of dollars that we're going to put our economy through. Those are the people that we're going to have possibly fewer job opportunities for because we're chasing a piece that small because we can. Should we? Can we afford that as a society when 24 million people are either unemployed or underemployed? When we're allowing a rogue agency to pursue that amount? Shame on us. I yield back my time.
Thank you, Mr. McKinley. At this time, recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Bilbray, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Homestead, I think you said it probably the most balanced approach, and the fact is both sides may be on denial of a lot of things. One, the health impacts of pollutants, but also the big denial, and I'll say this from the ranking member, the denial of the impact that regulation overall, and especially inappropriate regulation, has on not just the economy, but the entire lifestyle and thus the health style of the general public. That the impacts are there, and it seems like there's a real denial there. And I'll just say this, for those of you who don't know, everybody on this committee knows, I spent 6 years on the Air Resources Board of California, 10 years at the Air District. Mr. Omar, let me tell you something. I've been where you are. Can you come before us now and say that there hasn't been major mistakes made by the federal government in the implementation of the Clean Air Act?
I think there have been mistakes, and I think that many of them relate to the science not being followed, implementation schedules being moved around, so there wasn't regulatory predictability for companies to make informed decisions.
Or major strategies that were based on misperceptions and not science. You're too young to remember this, but some of us remember the federal government putting auto emission standards in place that basically forced Detroit to go to diesels during the 70s. The toxicity of diesel now is rated way over benzene, isn't it? So the federal government basically was pushing the private sector towards pollution with what was claimed to be an environmental regulation. Anybody here wants to stand up for the 1990 amendments to the Clean Air Act? Anybody here want to say that was a great idea?
Because there were certainly parts of them that were.
Parts of it, yeah. But the oxygenate mandate, the mandate that we put ethanol and MTBE in our fuel stream, we knew in California within months, we tried to say, federal government, stay out of this. Now, the science might have been flawed, but what I saw was more the politics was flawed. Wouldn't you agree that there was forces that claimed to be environmentally driven, that were driven by economic greed and the use of getting the federal government to force the general public to use products that they would have a monopoly on? Mr. O'Malley, wouldn't you agree with that?
Yes, and I agree with Mr. Homestead. I think the vast majority was a very good bill, but I think there were individual sections that were of special interest.
And would you agree that the mandate for MTBE and ethanol was an environmental mistake?
We have concerns about the ethanol mandate today as well.
Okay. So my point being, is that there's a lot of people that wrap themselves up into a claim of environmental strategy that does not reflect good science. Then there's other agendas, and these hidden agendas what I get upset about. While we're talking about reducing stationary sources here, and I'll tell you something, the secondary visual issue with me, that boggles my mind, because nowhere in the debate or discussion of the Clean Air Act did people talk about aesthetics. We talked about the public health. Would everybody agree that public health, protection of children, that was, wasn't that the selling point of the Clean Air Act to the people and to the Congress of the United States? Either one of your doctors. It was the health issue, right?
Correct.
Okay. Now we've got what appears to be mission creep. That, well, while we're doing this, why don't we set this, and why don't we use this, and why don't we use this? And we forget about where it comes down to. This is where we get down to the gentleman at the end. How often, when you're looking to build a road, does your air district require that we consider the environmental impact of the no project option? If you don't build that extra lane, what is going to be the congestion that is going to increase the pollution? How much weight under existing law does the no project option given when you consider it? Because I know they darn well make you look at the emissions while building that lane, but how much do they look at the benefits of reducing congestion?
It's relatively limited, the congestion reduction in most of the projects. The no-build option, they consider it, but it's really when they look at the air quality, because that's not really a major issue for us, and that's something that we advocate, because if you indeed want to create cleaner air, you have to remove the congestion. But people on the other side say you're expanding the highway system.
I would say this, and I'll say this to the both sides of the aisle and the leadership here. It's interesting that there are those who are quick to force the private sector to change the way you do business, to reduce emissions. But when you've got major universities and studies showing government inappropriate traffic control could be as high as 22% of auto emissions, this is someplace that federal government, Democrats and Republicans, ought to recognize that the sin of omission, that requiring the private sector to do a lot of things, but allowing the government to continue to force Americans to pollute and burn fuel they don't have to, and ignoring the government's impact on pollution, to me shows we have no credibility on this issue. It looks like we're more anti-business than we're pro-environment, and I think we need to change that. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman's time has expired. I want to thank the panel for joining us today. We appreciate your testimony. We've read all of the testimony, and your insights have been quite helpful. And with that, we will adjourn this hearing, and we'll keep the record open for 10 days. So thank you all very much, and that will adjourn today's hearing.